So let's talk Primaris Aggressors in 10th edition. Has one of the previously most dangerous Primaris units been left behind by the times? Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking Space Marines and more specifically Primaris Aggressors, doing a general overview of the units with strengths, weaknesses and combos, and talking about how to get the most out of them, even if, as mentioned, they no longer seem to be the absolute staple Space Marine meta unit right now. In the video, let's talk through their unit profile, strengths and weaknesses, and all their synergies, perhaps some of the reasons that they don't seem to be in quite as many competitive army lists right now, though I certainly think they can still be a very scary threat on the table, and how I'd choose to run them in-game. For their miniatures, the Aggressors were some of the first Primaris and Gravis armour alongside the Inceptors, the big and bulky plated Mark 10 armour with the sort of overarching armoured cowl over them, sacrificing a bit of mobility for some sheer protection and toughness. Aggressors are generally seen as a Primaris close support fire squad, a bit more emphasis on their shooting more so than their close combat, though they are still armed with mighty power fists if the enemy does manage to break through their withering hail of fire. Typically they're armed with either twin Boltstorm gauntlets and a Fragstorm grenade launcher, or Flamestorm gauntlets, and they most commonly get used in close quarters fighting, maybe jungles and cities and things like that, while other variants like long range fire support squads might be more cumbersome, and the additional protection needed by Gravis armour is seen as a big win. Some chapters tend to have a particular affinity with them, maybe most notably the Salamanders enjoying their Flamestorm gauntlet once. Miniatures wise, the Aggressors are one of Games Workshop's 3 model Primaris elites, currently £37, €47 or $60 from Games Workshop, their points per dollar being around about 2-ish, though that's partly due to the fact that they cost a bit more these days than they did. That's kind of middling for Space Marines, though I feel like a lot of these 3 model box sets tend to be a bit stingy on the plastic for the money that you pay. They have often been discounted in the past in various different box sets and combat patrols, though the previous Deathwatch and Blood Angels combat patrol sets that they featured in have been rotated out now. To me, the models initially felt like they were sort of Primaris going after the sort of same vibe as Terminators had, essentially up-armoured Space Marines armed with power fist and bolt weapons, just rather than having one bolt weapon and a power fist in one hand. They're going more sort of for the Marnius Calgar approach of having guns on their power fists, though they get some big belt-fed ammunition. It seems that Games Workshop decided that they wanted to have both though, and despite having a bunch of similarities, they do have a different sort of feel, more sort of new tech and a bit more emphasis on shooting as opposed to the Terminators, more sort of relic plate that's a bit more storage with their power fields built in, and perhaps a bit more emphasis on elite fighting, the first company, and close combat. Aggressors' rules have often been pretty interesting in 40k due to their sheer amount of damage output. I feel like that's sort of due to their unit nature, generally quite short ranged and both having interesting shooting and melee. And that often means they've tended to be some of the most efficient damage dealers for the Space Marines, even if it might mean that per point their durability isn't all that great. They might not be the stars of the Space Marine Codex right now, but in the past they've often been a unit that's had loads of attention, particularly with the double shooting mechanic that they had in editions past. As ever, if you were looking to pick up any Aggressors or any Space Marine miniatures in general, feel free to check out the channel's affiliate discount links down in the video description. They provide discounts on Warhammer models versus the Games Workshop web store, anywhere between 10 and 20% off depending on where you are around the world. A big thank you to folks using those if they were going to order in some Warhammer anyway. Let's get into their rules though, and this is the datasheet for the Primaris Aggressors in 10th edition, 120 points per 3 of them currently, or 240 for 6. They were initially a bit cheaper than that, but got some points increases pretty early in the edition when they were quite a focal unit. Like the rest of their Gravis counterparts, they move 5 inches with their chunky Gravis stat line, have a leadership 6+, and OC 1, so not really all that much weight on objectives, and if you put them in transport vehicles they typically take up 2 spaces. They can't ride in impulsors, but they take up 2 slots in things like Land Raiders or Repulsors. Gravis armour means that individually they're quite durable, particularly against small arms fire. Each essentially 40-point Space Marine is toughness 6, 3 wounds and a 3+ save. That puts them at a point where they're kind of hard to kill individually for a light infantry unit or something like that, but their per point durability just isn't really that great. Particularly things like strength 6 or higher special weapons will make a big mess of them quite quickly, as will anti-tank things. Compared with their weight in most factions' Terminators often tend to be a lot better at receiving punches on the front line, though as mentioned the Aggressors often tend to have the advantage in damage output with their rules over the editions. Talking of their damage output though, they're a mixed role unit with fairly equal power in both range and melee in my opinion. In melee they don't get a huge amount of attacks with 3 each with their power fists, but they really are quite general purpose. They hit on a 3+ at strength 8, AP -2 and damage 2 with twin links, and that's a profile that almost no matter what you're attacking against you're going to leave a mark. A squad of 3 of them on average kills around about 6 Termagants, around 4 standard Space Marines, which might be an ideal target. Maybe not quite so stand out against really tough stuff, perhaps 1 Terminator or 4 wounds to a toughness 12 3+ save vehicle like a Chaos Knight. Basically for 3 of them in melee it'd be enough to do at least a fair bit of damage, but they're not likely to be actually one-shotting vehicles unless you have a far bigger squad or more buffs. For their range damage, they get the choice between either Boltstorm Gauntlets with Fragstorm Grenades or Flamestorm Gauntlets. Either way, it's a whole bunch of Strength 4, AP 0 and Damage 1 shots. For the Flamestorm, it's 1 Torrent profile with Ignores Cover, Twin Links and D6 plus 1 attacks. For the Boltstorm and Fragstorm, the Boltstorm Gauntlets get 3 shots to 18 inches with Twin Links, and then the Fragstorm gets another D6 shots at 18 inches without Twin Links, but they do get Blast. And that means that if you've got a whole bunch of them, you could be racking up a serious amount of extra anti-horde shots with Blast if you have a suitable target. The AP 0 would mean that they'd be really quite inefficient against things like 2+ and 3+ saves, but if they're shooting at the closest thing, they also get their Close Quarters Firepower special rule, where per model, if they make an attack against the closest eligible target, they gain an additional AP -1. Between Twin Linked and AP -1, again that means that they should take at least some chip damage off a whole bunch of things out there. And if you add extra shooting boosts on top of that, then they can get a fair bit nastier. Overall, between the 2 of them, their damage output's really quite well balanced. Either one will kill something around about 10 termagants for a unit of 3 of them, do around 5 wounds to standard Space Marines, or do more like 2-ish wounds to either Terminators or 3+ save vehicles. Maybe the biggest difference for comparison is that the Boltstorm and Fragstorm will get extra range, so they'll be shooting out to 18 inches, and they'll also make use of any hit roll buffs that you might have, things like Oath of Moment or Incursors where the Flamestorm wouldn't. They can also make use of lethal hits as well if you had a character that gave you that. The Flamestorm ones won't be able to use anything that boosts the hit roll, but they'll get to ignore cover, so in a lot of situations they'll be actually the better damage output, and they also have pretty good overwatch as well if the opponent moves a unit up to get cooked by them. It could mean that they have to seriously think about where they might try and counter-attack them from, and might not be able to push light troops up onto mid-board objectives if there's aggressors nearby. Overall, between all that, they're a Primaris unit that's slow-moving and needs some delivery to get where it needs to go, but then when they get to strike they put a pretty decent amount of damage output out, particularly destructive against any 1-wound infantry with all that Twin Links damage 1 firepower. Though between their special rule with their shooting and Twin Linked Power Fists at melee, they've got enough stuff to be able to take a good chunk out of tougher things too. As a big scary unit with some fairly good damage output, they can take a lot of buffs and synergies quite well, anything from character synergies to various stratagems, and could be interesting enough with a couple of enhancements out there. For the downsides, their durability really isn't all that great for the cost. Short range means that they're going to need some help getting into their best targets unless they want to get screened out or shot down before they get there, and they did have a big nerf recently with the Fire Discipline combo basically getting removed, and that was one of the strongest ways to play in Gladius. For options to support them at the moment though, they could use Oath of Moment if you're taking the Boltstorm ones in particular. In particular, the Core Codex +1 to wound version for low strength attacks is pretty brutal, and doubly so with Twin Links. It means that Power Fists will be wounding things like Toughness 12 vehicles 3 out of 4 hits that you land, and you'll be landing most of your hits with Oath of Moment. And even Boltstorm Gauntlets will be wounding things like Land Raiders more often than not, given that with Boosted Oath they'd be wounding on a 5+ and then re-rolling the wound roll. I feel like Oath making them very scary though is kind of true for just about every Space Marine damage dealer unit. Maybe some use it a bit better than others, but maybe doesn't make them crazily stand out here. Otherwise, for general purpose stratagems, Armour of Contempt could be situationally handy if you think it's going to have enough of a difference to actually allow more of them to live to strike back. Everyone preserved could be hitting really quite hard when it gets back to your own turn, and Overwatch is pretty strong for flamers as well, though definitely isn't awful for say Boltstorm Gauntlets if they've got lethal hits in the unit, like maybe with the Apothecary Biologist. They could also take shooting buffs rather well, things like Incursors could have them hitting on a 2+, and they could get on well with multiple of the Storm Speeders. They could give you Ignores cover, which is quite a big deal on a whole bunch of AP -1 volume fire, and the Thunderstrike could give you a +1 to wound against monsters and vehicles, though maybe that's a little bit less of an interesting choice for core Codex Space Marine armies, given that they can get a +1 to wound from Oath when they need one. For character options to lead the unit, they've got a few generic ones. They've got a couple of generic ones and a few named ones. The Gravis Captain is 80 points to put on the board. He can give them some discounted stratagems and a fair bit more melee might. The discounted stratagems might depend on the detachment being used and whether or not you had something that was really good to support them. I feel like the Gravis Captain might be a bit more interesting in the sort of Salamanders Flamestorm style detachment maybe. Getting the Torrent stratagem for a bit cheaper could be interesting. The Apothecary Biologist can add lethal hits to the unit, and that further helps them punch off against tough stuff that they might otherwise struggle against a little bit, even with Twin Links. It's pretty powerful both at range and melee, though at 70 points you're now paying really quite a big premium for that. It feels like he's a lot more take or leave than he used to be, as opposed to the borderline auto-include that he was before. He does have OC3 as well, and can go up to OC9 if he slays something in melee. That's maybe a bit more likely to help with aggressors as opposed to some of the other units he could join, I guess. Otherwise, for the named characters, Calgar's probably the most interesting out of them. A big 200 points, so still going to be a really expensive unit if he's around. They generally quite like his special rules for delivery. They can advance, then shoot and charge, and that's quite nice when you can't access those in some of the detachments, maybe outside Gladius for example. And the Victrix Honor Guards can be a good choice for tanking damage for the unit, given that they have a 4+ invulnerable save and a 2+ save at base. They definitely make for a scary squad, but if you took a max unit of aggressors, that's going to be 440 points there, and even with Victrix guards and a whole bunch of chunky gravis, the unit's still not really all that durable for that point cost. Otherwise, Torgaradon can give you some ignored cover and some big punch against tanks and vehicles. I think he's usable enough with aggressors, though maybe not crazily standout value for his points cost. And then Ironfather Fyros is 95 points. He gives you a 5+ feel no pain ability for the unit, and does contribute with a bit of his own shooting and melee as well. I feel like he's one that you could run with aggressors if you wanted to, though it's just perhaps a bit awkward that a bunch of his rules are really tied up with supporting tanks and vehicles, where aggressors kind of need to get stuck in as optimally as possible, as fast as possible, and it might make him a bit of a better pairing with heavy intercessors perhaps. Otherwise though, for getting to the fight, being a unit that's relatively short ranged and fairly fragile per point, they're definitely one that could use transports really well. Land Raiders maybe tend to be the choice that people tended to use in the past for them, maybe in particular Land Raider Redeemer being kind of helpful, given that it's got 14 transport slots, so you can have a maxed out unit of 6 of them with a character attached if you like, plus those scary Flamestorm cannons have their own value in the mid-board too. Being able to move up, drop them out, have them shoot, and then also charge something definitely is a big win overall. Alternatively, repulsors feel pretty viable for them as well. Perhaps going to be a bit more tempting in the Firestorm Assault Force with all their transport things and a more focus on shooting. It could be a slightly cheaper battlefield taxi to get the squad into range. They could still use it as a bunker to charge out of if it made sense, though potentially if they just stop within embark range they could use the rules to get back into it. Aggressors definitely feel like one of the units that's more interested in the options that they could get from stratagems and enhancements in detachments. Really quite a big damage unit that anything that you can do to make that damage even scarier is rather nice. As mentioned earlier, Gladius used to be probably one of the best places to run them given the fire discipline enhancement, but Games Workshop changed that so it no longer triggers on a 5+ critical hits, so you can't have an apothecary biologist give them lethal and sustained hits on 5s anymore, though I guess they still get at least some value from being able to access advance and shoot and advance and charge. And the Lance melee stratagem accompanied with Power Fist is pretty punchy, and particularly in the turn where it might give them extra AP. Otherwise though, maybe the Firestorm Assault Force feels like one of their best homes. Strength 5 shooting up close is all very punchy, the assault keyword is very nice for them. There's a 1 CP plus 1 to wound stratagem if they're not shooting against their Oath of Moment targets, and in particular for the Flamestorm one there's a 2 command point devastating wound torrent one, which could have them being really effective even against the very toughest stuff in the game. The Forged in Battle automatic 6s to hit or wound is also really quite nice value on them, maybe could be nice on a Gravis captain, and they can certainly use some of the transport tricks as well, jumping out of a repulsor when they're shot and then firing back if it made sense. Otherwise, Vanguard Spearheads often been a place where they've been fielded. In the past, people have enjoyed putting them with an Apothecary Biologist with the Infiltrate enhancement, and Mardius Calgar and the unit as well, and then you've got basically a massive threat 500 point unit starting in the midboard that the opponent just really can't ignore. Though it's maybe a bit of a big play where if the opponent just gets to strike you early because of that, then it might just be not great value. They could use the extra +1 to hit and extra AP at greater than 12 inches as well. The Boltstorm variant might enjoy that to demolish something when shooting. Otherwise, the rest of the detachments maybe feel a little bit more mid. Some things on offer, but maybe not quite as focal. I guess they could be quite a nice unit in Stormlands for reactive moves. Being able to reposition 6 inches in the enemy turn is quite big for such a threatening unit that could hide. Here's some very rough numbers for the Firestorm combo with them. This one's quite a big investment one with 6 aggressors with Flamestorm gauntlets, and then either 2 command points for the Immolation protocols or a Gravis captain. That'll give you 27 auto hits at strength 5 plus whatever the captain can shoot if you've got one. 4 wound rerolls due to them being twin linked, devastating wounds on 6s, potentially meaning that if you're against a 2+ save foe, you could just reroll everything that isn't a 6. They probably don't really need the stratagem against things like Termagants or Intercessors, but it could be pretty fearsome against tough stuff, with average rolling a unit like this kills around about 4 Terminators, 10 wounds to a Rhino, or 8 wounds to a Land Raider, which really isn't too bad considering that's only half the story, and they'll do a bunch more damage once they charge in. For the more divergent Space Marine chapters, a lot of them could get some good interest from their detachments, though it's kind of notable that none of them have any named characters in Gravis armour yet. A lot of theirs often tend to prefer Terminator armour when they've got heavily armoured troops. Blood Angels definitely feels like an interesting one for them, given that they're a Space Marine melee unit, +2 strength to strength 10 on those twin-linked power fists, and a +1 attack on the charge is a pretty massive multiplier for them, plus access to advanced shoot and charge when they need it, or red rampage, make them just monstrously threatening. The same is kind of true for most other Space Marine melee units and Blood Angels though, and particularly when they're competing against fast-moving jump pack things like Sanguinary Guard. Black Templars and Space Wolves could get access to 6+ Feel No Pain, and quite a good amount of various different melee buffs if they wanted. The extra AP ones could be handy enough for AP-2 power fists going into 2+ saves and things, plus they've got the options for sustained and lethal hits when they need them. Deathwatch have their Indomitor kill team, and while they don't get the extra AP at range, they do get a +2 strength both at range and melee if they're either targeting the closest unit or charging in, and that's pretty massive on both of their profiles. Again, getting to strength 10 and twin linked is pretty brutal against, say, battle tanks, and strength 6 on their volume fire is just going to be very general purpose. Dark Angels maybe feel a little bit less focal for them, and a bit more competition for their Terminators. It maybe doesn't help that they also tend to use the more Codex detachments these days more so than their unique ones. Overall though, despite being an interesting unit with some big damage and a lot of options, it does seem that Aggressors have maybe fallen on hard times a bit in terms of competitive play. Currently, for strong Space Marine army lists, they seem to be near enough on plays. Really quite a big turnaround from the start of the edition, where it felt like the majority of Space Marine armies, if anything, were using at least some Aggressors as a focal combo, whether it was Fire Discipline and Gladius, infiltrating Calgar with a Biologist, or doing Firestorm things. It just feels like over the course of the Space Marine updates, a whole bunch of things have gradually chipped away at them. They did go up in points themselves, at least fairly early in the day, up to 120, which felt like a bit of a painful premium. The Land Raider Redeemer was getting played a lot, so that became one of the more expensive Land Raider variants, up at 280. The Apothecary Biologist and Fire Discipline were nerfed in tandem, both of them going up in points really quite a bit, though that maybe felt a bit more aimed at Eradicators being nerfed. That got to the point where the whole Fire Discipline combo was a bit more borderline, despite the massive damage that it could put out, and then Games Workshop doubled down on that by no longer allowing it to get critical hits on 5+, just meaning that it's in no way worth the points cost anymore. In recent times, even Marlies Calgar himself has also increased in cost as well. Typically people tend to run him more with company heroes now, though he does have other options. That just seems to be the go-to for a cheap and toughish retinue that still has some threat. They have had some positives, such as the Repulsor getting 14 transport slots and getting access to new style Oath and Moment, though just between all of those things, the ways that Aggressors often tends to be functioning earlier in 10th edition don't usually tend to be quite as useful anymore. I feel like they maybe pushed them to a place where you sort of had to invest in the big combos to make them useful, and now even then it's just generally seen as not quite as worth it, even if you do. I don't think that they're unplayable in casual games as a big centerpiece damage unit, but even then it maybe feel like a unit that you need to go carefully with. If they manage to get the strike on some optimal targets and unleash as much damage as they possibly can, they absolutely could tear the heart out of an enemy army in a single turn if the stars align. But if something goes bad and they're not able to get into the right targets, or they get attacked before they get to strike, then you could be losing a lot of points really quite quickly. It seems that for mainline Space Marine damage dealers in general, it's often gun tanks and dreadnoughts that seem to be leading the way at the moment. Things like ballistas, dreadnoughts and vindicators with big hitting firepower. Maybe some character threats leading company heroes or similar, perhaps some Eradicators or Inceptors in Vanguard maybe. It does vary a fair bit based on detachment, but Aggressors just don't usually tend to be one of the main things considered. In any case though, even if they might not be the most meta pick in the world anymore, I'm sure there's still plenty of people out there looking to make the most of them on the tabletop. I think if I were playing with them at the moment, I'd generally go for a squad of 6 with some sort of central interesting enhancement, and probably just one big investment unit in an army list. I think I'd broadly go Boltstorm Gauntlets with the Fragstorm, though maybe Flamestorm in the Firestorm detachment specifically, and then probably have a leader character of some description. The Apothecary Biologist could make them punch up a fair bit. The Gravis Captain's fine, and Tor Garadon or Marlies Calgar are both alright here, and then just use any damage buffing strats that you have in your own detachment. Ideally they'd either want something that can allow them to advance and charge out of cover to give them a better threat range, or more likely either a Repulsor or a Land Raider to get them into the fight safely. So between all that, they're likely to be really quite a big chunk of the army, and then have to really think about where they commit, hopefully jumping out of a Land Raider, destroying something with their close range firepower with AP-1, ideally a Horde unit if they can for that, and then charging either the same thing or something else and putting all those power fists to work. If they could somehow do that while still being in a somewhat safe place to not take enemy firepower back, that would probably be the dream, but I feel like if you're going for maximal damage output, they're probably going to be fairly front and centre and focused down fairly painfully after. That could still mean that you lose a lot of punch on the strike back, but hopefully they take the heat off the rest of the Space Marine army for a turn while that happens. In any case though, let me know what you make of the Aggressor squad in-game at the moment. Have you been putting them on the table recently in 10th edition or not? Look forward to hearing all your thoughts down in the comments below. As mentioned, if you'd like to support the channel, then feel free to check out the channel's discount affiliate links in the video description if you're picking up any Warhammer of any sort in the near future. There's Element Games in the UK for 15% off, Gap Games in Australia for 20%, Fairness Workshop in Canada for 10%, Wargame Portal for 15% in the USA, and Tash and Geldy for 16% in the EU. A massive thanks to anyone supporting via those when they do happen to pick up expensive plastic miniatures. I'll leave this one there for now though. Feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics if you'd like to see more like this. I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. I'm sure we'll have plenty more for the Space Marines. If you'd like to support the channel more directly, there's the Patreon page linked down in the video description as well. That's got a few advantages, including seeing certain videos early from time to time. Again, a big thank you to anyone back in there. But just overall, an enormous thank you to anyone watching, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.